Nisreen Abdelmajid is a technical producer at AMI Audio and the producer of AMI Audiobook Review, joining us from Mississauga. Niz, do you want to set up today's AMI Audiobook Review segment?
Coming up in just a few minutes, Jeffrey Rainey is an avid audiobook listener, and he will be joining us for another edition of Rapid Fire Review. And today's theme for a Rapid Fire Review is baseball book titles. Jacob, what's your take on sports book titles, I guess? Just not just baseball, but any sports related book titles.
Okay, this is something I've been pondering for the past couple of days leading up to this segment. I've read a handful of sports books and I enjoyed all of them, but in a very different way. Like, it was a very unique type of enjoyment that I can't quite put my finger on. It's like I have ideas, but hopefully you, Jeffrey, and I can break this down a little bit.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
All right, pretty short and simple. Just doing a rapid fire review with Jeff Rainey's 5 baseball themed books. Before we get started, though, Niz, I know that you're not a sports fan. To an extent. Like, is there any interest at all in sports books? And like, I'll tell you right now, I feel like just because you don't like sports, it doesn't mean you won't like a sports book.
I wanted to actually bring this question to Jeffrey as well, but the question is, I know a lot of people have a problem with sound effects for audiobooks, and there's a bit of back and forth. People like sound effects in audiobooks, people don't. When it comes to sports themed books, I would be all for sound effects, and I want to actually feel the game going on. I really do. I want to take a listen and hear the shoes squeaking, if it's like sport, if it's basketball. And I think that's a sport that I would consider listening to an audiobook about. I have to admit, baseball was never a pick for me. I never really liked baseball, playing it in school and everything like that. I had never had an interest in baseball.
Fair enough. So if you're going to pick up a sports audiobook, it better have production value, because like the sports alone, just like that setting doesn't really do it for you. That's totally fair. Hopefully after this conversation, we'll have changed your mind. All right. I think we're pretty much all set to get started with today's AMI audiobook review segment. The older they get, the better they get when they were younger. Jim Bouton, Ball 4. You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. I've enjoyed every sports book I've read, but I enjoy them in a way that I can't quite put my finger on. They're just different somehow. I have some theories, but I'm really not quite sure how else to put it. Maybe today's guest can help me out. Jeffrey Rainey is one of our avid audiobook listeners, and he's at the plate ready to take a swing at today's rapid fire review. How's it going, Jeff?
I see what you did there. Very nice. Good morning, Jacob. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm glad you appreciate it. I was way too proud of myself for coming up with that. This rapid fire review has a baseball theme. I'm going to go ahead and take a shot in the dark and say that you're a big baseball fan. Is that right?
You hit it right out of the park there, my friend. Yes, I am. I did not start out that way, though, so I can echo what Nisreen was saying. I've been on both sides of this fence before. So
you have 5 sports books that you brought us for RFR. Before we get started, like, what is it about sports books that does it for you?
It's the stories for me. It's I guess the humanizing of the players and the personnel that make these games go around. And when we see them in action, they're very competitive, they're very focused, and they're very set in their in making their being the best versions of themselves. Whereas when we get books, they are much more human, they're much more revealing, and there's just so much to be explored in any sport, but particularly in this case I chose baseball just because that's probably my number one favorite, and it is baseball season right now.
In my observations, I find a theme in sports books is a lot about like exposing the dark side or the unsavory side of sports, what it takes to play at a high level, the character of these players that we idolize. These are heroes to us, but the truth is that they're flawed human beings. And are all of the 5 books that you brought us, are these all nonfiction autobiographies?
They are. One of them I wouldn't classify as not a biography, although it is definitely a tell-all book in its own right. And also, thank you for stealing one of my segments there. Now I'll have to think of another one on the fly.
It's okay. Well, there's a lot more to elaborate there, though.
There is.
Okay, here are the rules for rapid fire review, just to remind everyone. So, Jeffrey, you brought us 5 books, all baseball themed. We're going to go through them one by one. Nizreen and I are going to alternate reading the titles and the author. After you hear the author, you're going to hear a ticking sound. It's going to go for 15 seconds. During that 15 seconds, you have to give us a synopsis and your thoughts on that book in only 15 seconds before the bell goes off. Once the bell goes off, you can finish your sentence, but don't go further than that. We're going to do that for all 5 books, so you get a general idea of what the book is and what Jeff's thoughts are on the book. And then finally, at the end, you can pick one of those 5 books and you can have a full, proper, deep dive into it. And I know which one you chose. I won't spoil it, but I'm really excited to talk about it. Niz, Jeff, are you guys all set?
Yes, sir.
You're here?
Okay, let's do it. The first one is The Soul of Baseball, A Road Trip Through Buck O'Neill's America by Jeff Poznansky. Okay, wait. We'll do that again. Here, I'll say the title again, and then we'll play the ticking sound effect. Here we go. The Soul of Baseball, A Road Trip Through Buck O'Neill's America by Jeff Poznansky.
This book follows Buck O'Neill, who was a first baseman, manager, and later scout for the Kansas City Monarchs, and he devoted his life to talking about the Negro Leagues of Baseball and the museum that launched afterwards.
Ooh, perfect.
I'm so ignorant. I did not know that was a thing. Really? When was, like, around what time? We're going to move on to the next book, but I need to know, around what time was this?
It was during the first half of the 20th century. The Negro Leagues existed alongside the major leagues for predominantly black players who were prohibited from playing in the majors up until 1947 when Jackie Robinson crossed the colored line.
Oh, wow. Okay, I had no clue. All right, Niz, do you want to read the next one?
Next book is Ball 4 by Jim Bouton.
This book is both a tell-all book that borders on sitcom. It was written in 1969 by aging knuckleballer Jim Bouton, and it talks about the culture within the clubhouse, and I cannot recommend it enough.
Knuckleballer sounds like an insult. Is that a type of pitcher? What's a knuckleballer?
It is a type of pitcher and / type of pitch. Depending on who you ask, it might be considered an insult, but it's actually a very effective way of getting batters out.
Huh. All right, moving on. Here's the next one. The Big Chair by Ned Colletti. Sorry, I'll do that again. The Big Chair by Ned Colletti and Joseph A. Reaves.
So we as baseball fans watch the everyday product on the field, but the reality is the general manager's job is running all aspects of the team, from all 3 minor league systems to the finances to buying and trading these players, bringing fans in, and weathering the storm.
Ooh.
General managers always have a really interesting position to me in sports because they practically treat players like peons, and they literally trade them like they're trading cards. It's really one of the weirdest positions to be on. Like the aspect of the job when you're a professional player in a league that allows trades. Imagine you work at like a Burger King and you get traded to go work at a McDonald's in Miami. Like, it's really weird. It's one of the most unique things about American sports. All right, Naze, you want to get the next one?
Yes. The next one is Hello Friends by Jerry Howarth.
Jerry Howarth was a longtime voice of the Toronto Blue Jays on the radio. He was there from 1982 through 2017, and this book was written in the style of his baseball broadcasts, and it's where you go if you need to hear that voice one more time, or maybe two.
And did he narrate the audiobook himself?
He did.
Oh, cool. And what do you mean that he wrote the book in his broadcast style?
So I guess he wrote and read the book in the same delivery at which you would hear him call a baseball game.
Oh, okay. Huh.
It's fantastic. It's what got me into baseball in the first place, was listening to Jerry Howarth on the radio.
Okay, he was the radio announcer. Oh, okay, very cool. All right, here's the next one, or the last one, Where Nobody Knows Your Name by John Feinstein.
So this is obviously a play on the title Where Everybody Knows Your Name from Cheers. Nobody dreams of playing in the minor leagues. There's nothing romantic about it, yet it's where you start out and can oftentimes stay in while trying to make it to the big leagues. If you don't like it, do a better job.
It really is all about the performance aspect, right? If you don't perform, you're going to be in the minor leagues, or not even in the minor leagues. You wonder where the players' heads are at, the ones that are in the minor leagues. If they, like, obviously everybody wants to be in the upper leagues, but it must be hard to feel stuck there and just feel like you strived to become a professional baseball player and it's just not, you didn't get to that point. I feel like there's a lot of interesting storytelling there and a lot of interesting characters in minor leagues, because sometimes players will get sent down to the minors not because they're a bad player, but because they're problematic, or there's something about their personality that just doesn't mesh with the rest of the team. All that to say, I feel like there's a lot of stories to dive into. Okay, of all these 5 books, which did you want to rant or rave about? Honestly, whatever you want to do, you have the stage. Which book do you want to talk about?
So all 5 of these books are raves for me, but I would like to elaborate on Ball 4 by Jim Bouton.
All right. What do we need to... Okay, how about this? I'll start. I did a little bit of research on this book, and something I see constantly is that the release of this book and the impact on the baseball world when it came out in the early 70s was almost more impactful than the book itself. It feels like the effect of this book was almost more of a story than the book itself.
That's correct, and it really personifies what we open this segment with, which is really, it brought baseball to a more human level. Up until that point, the owners and American culture really had baseball treated as this, this reverence, or with such reverence that these players were somehow superheroes that were larger than life and that were above everything else, when really they were young, flawed, they were competitive, they were funny, they were mischievous, they were everything. It also underlines the struggles that players had with owners, particularly before the advent of free agency, and even after, because this book has been re-released and updated over the next 40 to 50 years, and narrated by Jim Bouton himself.
Now, who is Jim Bouton? Because I feel like who he is very important in this story.
So Jim Bouton started out as a sort of phenom pitcher for the New York Yankees in the early 1960s. He'd been to many a World Series with them, but through the latter stages of the latter half of the decade, he started to get hurt because conditioning was not anywhere near what it is now. And so he was demoted to the minor leagues, and once he was unable to sustain his pitches, he had to resort to the knuckleball, which requires very little arm effort and a lot of concentration and finger technique. He was then traded to a upstart team called the Seattle Pilots, and this team was composed of many people like Jim himself. These were aging players that other teams more or less didn't have a spot for, but now they're coming over to a new team. It's a fresh start for everyone, and there's dreams of reuniting of becoming the old versions of themselves, where they all hit 300 and struck 27 batters out in the game for pitchers. And that's really what tees the book up. You're
listening to AMI Audiobook Review. I'm Jacob Szymanski talking to Jeff Rainey and Nisreen Abdul-Majid about this RFR that we're doing about baseball books. Currently, we're talking about Ball 4 by Jim Bouton. Jeff, can you talk to us a bit about like the writing style of this book? Since I think it's an autobiography, is there like a formula to it like a lot of autobiographies have? Like, what should we expect in terms of writing style?
So it's written as a diary. So Jim wrote a diary throughout the 1969 baseball season from February through October. And every day was full of something, whether if it was how the game was going, whether if it was what was going on in his personal life, conversations with, within the bullpen or the dugout. He himself was bounced back, to from the majors to the minor leagues after spring training because he had a dip in performance, and then eventually got called back up again about a month afterwards. So there was a lot that he went through, and was traded halfway through the season. And so he ended up going to another new team and getting reacquainted with everybody. So, yeah, the book is written as his daily diary from 1969.
Wow. Wait, so that means that he effectively wrote the book while he was still an active player, and it was a tell-all about himself and all the other players around him. That's like if Sidney Crosby wrote a book like right now about him and all his teammates. That's crazy.
He did.
Okay, so this like tell-all aspect of not just this book, but a lot of the books that you mentioned, it's very gossipy, but it's a lot of like spilling the dirt. Do you think there's something like morally or ethically wrong about that? I know it's a very common type of book, but is there something like morally wrong with that? I want to hear from you, Niz. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think there is. Yeah, for sure. I do have a question for both of you, though. I know, Jeffrey, you picked out non-fictional books in your list, but would you rather non-fictional books overall for sports-themed books or fictional?
I'm not sure if it was the chicken or the egg that came first. Nonfiction tends to be my number one choice for books. I love memoirs, autobiographies, behind-the-scenes stories and anything like that. So this realm of sports book kind of, I guess, in some ways, I'm not sure if the game came first before the book. But I guess if there was any fictional book that comes to mind, I would say something like maybe Charlie Brown. I know that Charlie Brown was a big baseball fan himself. And the author was very deliberate not to mention any particular player's name so that the book would be about whomever you wanted it to be, regardless of when you read it.
I don't know. I find sports themselves, even if you're not a fan of sports, Niz, you have to admit there's a lot of very human aspects to the stories around sports. And I'm talking about like the real life stories that happen every year of challenges and perseverance and crushing defeats and losing at the last second, these great comebacks, these great stories of resilience. Yeah, the backstories of these players, where they came from, their bond. Like there's all sorts of these things, and it's the pageantry of sport. And that's where I find there's so many of these stories that, especially in like, there's so many radio stations that do non-stop sports talk and a billion podcasts that react to everything that have to do with sports. In these tell-all books, what you're getting is really what the people want, is direct information, like unfiltered for the most part, of just straight up gossip, which during like the day-to-day news cycle you don't necessarily get. You're just like coming up with theories as to what happened. You know the outcome, but you don't really know why it happened. And these books, these autobiographies from first-hand accounts of people who are involved in sports, they're giving you what the people want. And that's my pitch for why you should be listening to these books if you're a sports fan. Now, if you're not a sports fan, what do you think you could like get out of an autobiography from an athlete? What do you think, Jeff?
Well, if you're interested in sociology or even just different character studies, you definitely get a no shortage of really high, ambitious, and borderline type A personalities, I guess. And you really get acquainted with their mannerisms, their routines, their some cases superstitions, and really just their journeys. It's all of it. All of this is a journey. And the one thing about baseball too, just to kind of carry on what you mentioned earlier, Jacob, is that the game is slow enough where you can squeeze in little stories in between pitches and in between moves and from the manager. There's a lot more time to elaborate on individual players or recap events, whereas something like hockey or basketball or even football is very fast paced and there's very little time for talk, sometimes in between power plays or penalties and stuff like that. So.
Interesting. I never thought of that. So you mean like in the actual game of baseball,
during the broadcast of the game itself,
during the broadcast, so there's lots of time to do research on players, where they came from, their backstories. That's really cool. Bringing it back to these books though, if I hate baseball, is it as simple as saying that I just will not like these books, period?
I'm biased, but in taking off the hat, likely yes. There's got to be some kind of hook that captures your interest, and a lot of times, if it isn't the game itself, it's probably the entertainment or the gossip factor to it as well.
The gossip factor. I think we all like gossip, though. The thing is, gossip doesn't really work unless you know the people. Niz, why are you not interested in sports books?
I don't know. I feel like I just never gave it a chance, never really thought about it. I mean, I'm interested in autobiographies for musicians and different artists. When it comes to sports, never gave it a chance. But what I'm interested in is, like, as you guys said, the element to it. So there's the backstory, the challenges that they go through. Think about how the documentaries that we've seen about different artists and musicians and athletes. And I'm interested in those documentaries about athletes. But when it comes to an audiobook, as I mentioned before, I think production value is very important to pull me into the audiobook. I think that would really pull me in for sure.
So in one of the books you mentioned, the one what's it called, Hello Friends by Jim Howarth. Hello Friends.
Jerry Howarth.
Jerry Howarth, thank you. That one, you would expect it to be narrated like a professional because this is a broadcaster. Now the book that's narrated by Jim Bouton, because he's not a professional broadcaster, he's a baseball player. I'm like, I don't really care if it's the actual dude from the book. Like, if it's a bad narration, it's a bad narration. Like, how does he do in that narration role?
It's interesting you say that, because after his tenure in baseball, he did go into sports broadcasting in the 70s before he made a comeback into baseball. And that's why this book has been re-released up until the mid-2000s, because it elaborates on every phase of his life and his career. But in this case, are we talking about how his style is in this book?
Yeah, exactly. Like how does he do as a narrator?
He really embodies his character. He probably read it, especially when he read the updated version. He's reading something that was written 40, 50 years ago, and he puts himself in that same spot, so you feel as if you're going through the day with him during all the ups and downs. There are times where he's reading a book and a joke will be so funny that he'll just burst out laughing unapologetically. It's
really?
as if oh yeah,
in the narration, like it's in the audiobook, just him bursting out laughing.
Oh yeah, it's literally like this.
See, that's personality. I like that.
Wow, I've only seen that once before, and it was in an autobiography in My Body by Emily Ratajkowski. She's a model, and at one point she's telling a very emotional story, and she bursts into tears, and they kept it in for like a solid 10 seconds. It was very surprising, but honestly it was very moving.
I like that.
Yeah, I kind of do too. I actually, now that I'm thinking about it, in the books that we read by Tom Hanks recently, The Making of Another Motion Picture Masterpiece, he also has a moment where he laughs out loud, like genuinely, and they just kept it in. But back to sports books though. When we're talking about just the feeling of reading these sports books, and I talked about how the sports books that I've read in the past I've enjoyed, but I don't really know why. I find it hard to put a finger on. One of my theories is that it's kind of just comforting to absorb yourself in something that isn't related to an existential crisis like world hunger and cancer and global warming and politics and wars. When you're absorbing yourself in a game, which is what sports are, there's something comforting and safe about that. If we're finding time to play sports, it means we're doing pretty good. It means we're doing okay. We have time to do this, right?
It's an escape for you.
It's such an escape. It's the most escapist thing. It's a double escapism, because sports in themselves are escapism, and then a book is an escape. So you're escaping yourself in something that's already escapism.
Well said.
Yeah.
And it did make me reflect on the place sports has in our society. If you already we see the amount of sports books that come out every year, which is tons of them. It just shows you that a lot of people care about sports. It's important, and it's important in a way that's kind of strange, because objectively speaking, sports aren't something that we need. It's not a necessity whatsoever, but we make it matter. Any thoughts on that, Jeff?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I would largely say that's true. I think in a lot of countries, in the U.S., it's considered the national pastime. In other countries, like in Central and South America, a lot of people, that's their ticket to the to a world outside of their homeland. If conditions aren't very well, that's the way they can get out, or even sometimes defect, sometimes illegally. Tony Oliva from the 1960s actually changed his name to Tony Oliva for political reasons, so he wasn't
really
tracked on his way out. But yeah, so they're definitely they're definitely part of life. Are they essential? That's a good question. I mean, I know some people who grew up playing sports, or who grew up in sports families, would definitely view them as essential. It's kind of like music. They're could you go your life without music? I mean, I certainly couldn't. It's almost like the spice of life. It's physical. It's either you play it, you watch it, or both. So that's a good question.
I never thought of it that way. There really are a lot of parallels between sports and music. Ultimately, it's entertainment. We put a lot of value in it. We impart our individuality into them both, right? That's so interesting. Jeff, I want to thank you so much for bringing these 5 books to our attention.
No problem. And Nazreen, don't worry, I've definitely been on the opposite side. I did not grow up a sports fan. That came later with the result of great broadcasts, which actually felt like reading audiobooks. So I definitely have been on your side before.
This whole segment is just convincing me to love baseball books.
Or at the very least, try them. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob.
All right, if anybody's curious, those 5 books were The Soul of Baseball by Joe Posnanski, Ball 4 by Jim Bouton, The Big Chair by Ned Colletti, Hello Friends by Jerry Howarth, and Where Nobody Knows Your Name by John Feinstein. That was Jeffrey Rainey, one of our avid audiobook listeners. He was here for Rapid Fire Review. And Nisreen Abdul-Majid, who is joining us. She's the producer of AMI Audiobook Review. I want to thank you all for listening. I'm Jacob Szymanski. I'll see you tomorrow.